Work on this film by one of Hollywood's leading directors was delayed for over 20 years, as major studios feared financing it due to the risk of failure. While the movie didn't become a box office hit, it rightfully earned its place among the best films of its genre. Movies Inside Out presents Gangs of New York is a historical crime drama directed by Martin Scorsese, depicting the brutal conflict between native-born Americans and Irish immigrants in mid-19th century New York. The film was released in 2002. Why was a film about New York shot in Rome? How did Eminem help Daniel Day-Lewis prepare for his role? And why couldn't Leonardo DiCaprio step outside during breaks? Find out all this and more in our new video. The creation story. The story of Gangs of New York began in 1970 when Martin Scorsese came across the book of the same name by Herbert Asbury, detailing the criminal underworld of mid-19th century New York. The book was a revelation for Scorsese, who had been fascinated by the city's history since childhood. Inspired, he became passionate about creating an epic film about the conflict between Irish immigrants and native New Yorkers. Scorsese immediately shared his vision with his friend, film critic and screenwriter Jay Cox, who was equally intrigued by the city's history, particularly its criminal underworld. Cox conceived the foundation of the plot, drawing inspiration from Bruce Springsteen's song Thunder Road, which referenced a street savior. This savior, a young Irish criminal leading a gang, was to be the protagonist, with Malcolm McDowell slated for the role. However, at the time, Scorsese was still a young and relatively unknown director, making such a grand and costly project little more than a dream. By the late 1970s, following the success of Mean Streets and Taxi Driver, Scorsese had established himself as one of Hollywood's most prominent filmmakers. In 1977, he and Cox revisited Gangs of New York and even drafted an initial screenplay. In 1979, Scorsese acquired the rights to adapt Asbury's book, intending to cast his favorite actor, Robert De Niro, as Amsterdam. However, the biggest challenge was recreating an authentic backdrop of New York, as the Irish slums of 5 Points that Scorsese wanted to depict no longer existed. Producers were reluctant to fund such extensive set construction, and after the financial failure of Heaven's Gate, studios postponed funding costly historical dramas indefinitely. In 1991, Martin Scorsese and producer Alberto Grimaldi revived the project with Universal Pictures, which allocated a $30 million budget. By then, De Niro was too old to play Amsterdam, so Scorsese considered him for the role of Bill the Butcher instead. In the mid-1990s, a young Leonardo DiCaprio expressed interest in the project. Despite knowing little about New York's history, he was eager to work with Scorsese. Notably, Scorsese had already been following DiCaprio's career. Robert De Niro, who had worked with the young actor on This Boy's Life, was deeply impressed by his talent and recommended him. Scorsese recognized DiCaprio as a future generational star and enthusiastically brought him aboard. However, development dragged on, and in 1997, Universal relinquished the problematic project, transferring the rights to Disney. Joe Roth, Disney's chairman at the time, rejected the project due to its excessive violence, which clashed with the studio's image. Still, Scorsese remained persistent. He pitched the film to all major studios, but none showed interest in funding such an ambitious production. In 1999, Scorsese finally secured a deal with Harvey Weinstein, co-founder of Miramax Films. Weinstein's main motivation for taking on Gangs of New York was Leonardo DiCaprio, whose massive post-Titanic popularity guaranteed box office potential. That same year, Scorsese brought Jay Cox back to rewrite the script. However, Weinstein was dissatisfied with the draft, ultimately hiring Steven Zaillian and Kenneth Lonergan to finalize the screenplay. Casting. As mentioned earlier, the role of Amsterdam Vallon was given to Leonardo DiCaprio in the mid-1990s, And since then, Scorsese did not consider other actors for the part.
You're the priest's son, aren't you? You, get away from me, understand?
However, in the late 1970s, the director had initially considered Dan Aykroyd for the role, alongside Robert De Niro. In the early 1990s, Scorsese envisioned Robert De Niro as Bill the Butcher Cutting, but De Niro had to leave the project due to the production's constant delays. At various points, John Belushi, Willem Dafoe, and Tom Hanks were also considered for the role, but they declined for different reasons. By the end of the decade, Scorsese had a new favorite for the film's main antagonist, Daniel Day-Lewis, with whom he had worked on The Age of Innocence. At the time, Day-Lewis was enjoying an indefinite hiatus and learning the craft of shoemaking. The actor was content with his unusual hobby, but could not resist accepting Martin Scorsese's offer, as he greatly admired the director's talent.
My father gave his life making this country what it is.
The role of Jenny Everdeen was initially offered to Sarah Michelle Gellar, but she declined due to scheduling conflicts with her work on the TV series Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Scorsese then considered a number of actresses, including Claire Forlani, Heather Graham, Monica Potter, Katie Holmes, and Mina Suvari, before selecting Sarah Polley. However, the studio insisted on casting a more commercial star, which led to the inclusion of Cameron Diaz, who had already starred in hits like There's Something About Mary and Charlie's Angels.
I don't know which one's yours.
Liam Neeson was cast as Priest Vallon.
In laws of combat, I accept the challenge of the so-called natives.
Although Scorsese initially wanted him to play Monk McGinn. Ultimately, Brendan Gleeson took on the role of Monk.
Then I'm your man.
John C. Reilly, who played Happy Jack Mulroney, was initially hesitant to join the film, but was persuaded by his friend, director Paul Thomas Anderson, to accept the role.
Thank you, boys. You keep out of trouble now.
The role of Amsterdam's friend Johnny Sirocco was initially offered to Tobey Maguire, who turned it down. Henry Thomas eventually joined the cast in the role.
I let her take things all the time. Is that right?
Martin Scorsese himself made a cameo in the film, appearing as the owner of the mansion Jenny robbed by posing as a maid. The filming process. Principal filming for Gangs of New York took place in Rome and London between December 18, 2000 and March 30, 2001. From the start, Scorsese knew that shooting Gangs of New York on location would be impossible. To bring his vision of the city to life, the director tasked Italian production designer Dante Ferretti, with whom he had worked on The Age of Innocence, with creating large-scale sets. Scorsese had already shared his ideas with Ferretti years earlier, and recommended he read several books about New York's history. After studying the materials, Ferretti created detailed sketches and models to determine exactly what needed to be constructed for the film. At the Cinecittà Studios in Rome, Ferretti recreated nearly 2 kilometers, about 1.2 miles, of 19th century New York streets in just 5 months. This included Paradise Square, the Old Brewery, Satan's Circus, the Chinese Pagoda, Broadway, a harbor complete with 2 ships, and all the interior sets. To depict the slums of the Five Points district, Ferretti drew inspiration from an 1827 painting by George Catlin. To help cinematographer Michael Ballhaus understand the film's intended visual style, Scorsese gave him a book of Rembrandt engravings as a reference. Interestingly, Star Wars director George Lucas visited the massive gang sets and remarked that such work could now be done using CGI. While he was technically correct, the practical sets provided an unparalleled sense of realism, allowing the actors to fully immerse themselves in the world of the film and connect with their characters. That said, some CGI effects were used. For example, the elephant featured in the film was entirely computer generated because Scorsese couldn't find a suitable animal trainer. In a panic, he called Lucas, who referred him to top visual effects experts. Additionally, the blood on Amsterdam's neck in the scene where he retrieves his medallion from Jenny was digitally added in post-production. Costumes were also vital in capturing the spirit of the era. While plenty of resources detailed the clothing of the upper and middle classes, Academy Award-winning costume designer Sandy Powell had to closely examine paintings and daguerreotypes to understand how the lower classes and criminals dressed. Powell and Scorsese decided that each gang would have its own distinct color scheme, making them easily identifiable from a distance. The wardrobe team created approximately 7,000 costumes for the main cast and extras. Historians specializing in New York's past were consulted during production, allowing the filmmakers to examine a unique collection of items uncovered during excavations in the Five Points district. Unfortunately, before the film's release, all these artifacts, stored in the basement of one of the World Trade Center buildings, were destroyed. Special attention was given to the characters' speech, as their accents needed to immediately convey their backgrounds. Dialect coach Tim Monick opted against generic Irish accents, instead focusing on the regional dialects of Ireland and Britain. Amsterdam's accent, for instance, was designed as a blend, reflecting a character born in Ireland but raised in the US.
If you had said chiseler, now there's a word I understand, you know? Now is that what you're calling us?
For the native New Yorkers, like Bill the Butcher, Monick studied old poems, newspaper articles that imitated vernacular speech for comedic effect, and the Rogue's Lexicon, a compendium of 19th century criminal slang. Daniel Day-Lewis is known for his unconventional preparation methods, and his role as Bill the Butcher was no exception. The actor hired circus performers to teach him knife throwing, and worked in a butcher shop for several weeks to master the art of carving meat. He also delved deeply into the history of New York's underworld. Ironically, though his character harbored an intense hatred for Irish immigrants, Day-Lewis himself is half Irish.
I don't see no Americans. I see trespassers.
Day-Lewis also revealed that he often listened to Eminem's The Way I Am on set. The rapper's bravado and showmanship helped him connect with the larger-than-life personality of Bill the Butcher. Once in character, Day-Lewis found it hard to break out of it. He continued speaking in his character's accent, even off set. One evening, Leonardo DiCaprio and Scorsese persuaded him to join them for dinner. Day-Lewis went to the restaurant in full Bill the Butcher mode, startling the waitress so much that she was afraid to approach their table. Leonardo DiCaprio, however, didn't always take his duties as seriously. One morning, after arriving late on set following a wild party, he was scolded in front of the entire crew. For most of his time in Rome, DiCaprio had to stay in his hotel to avoid throngs of fans who followed him wherever he went. Striving for greater realism, Scorsese instructed Cameron Diaz to actually hit DiCaprio during their fight scenes. She did so with gusto, leaving DiCaprio complaining of dizziness and facial numbness after several takes. To help Diaz convincingly play a pickpocket, Scorsese hired an Italian thief with 30 years of experience to teach her. And then they wondered where half the film's budget went. Day-Lewis wore a glass prosthetic to simulate his character's artificial eye. He even learned how to tap it with the tip of a knife without blinking. He probably used it to open beer bottles too. During one intense scene, DiCaprio accidentally broke Day-Lewis's nose. Despite the injury, Day-Lewis calmly finished the scene. However, he found his character's greasy hairstyle so irritating that he shaved his head immediately after filming Wrapped. Originally, the murder of Priest Vallon was meant to be much more gruesome, with Bill chopping off all his limbs with an axe. Ultimately, Vallon was simply stabbed to death, though a shot of Bill striking his left hand with an axe remains in the film. Many of the gangs mentioned in the film were real, and the character of Bill the Butcher was based on a historical gang leader named William Poole, also known as the Butcher. Poole was killed several years before the draft riots depicted in the film. Interestingly, Bill's dying words
I die a true American.
were also Poole's actual last words. The character Hellcat Maggie, played by Cara Seymour, was based on a real woman who filed her teeth to bite opponents' necks and wore brass claws. Initially, composer Elmer Bernstein was hired to create the film's score, but Scorsese later decided his work didn't fully capture the film's atmosphere. Howard Shore, renowned for his The Lord of the Rings scores, was brought in instead. The soundtrack also featured modern compositions, folk melodies, and traditional songs. Throughout production, there were constant clashes between Scorsese and producer Harvey Weinstein. Scorsese was adamant about maintaining his vision for the film's style and runtime, while Weinstein pushed for a more commercial approach. Weinstein frequently visited the set, leaving lists of questions and critiques, much to Scorsese's frustration. At one point, the director threatened to leave the project altogether if Weinstein didn't back off. Movie mistakes and errors. Despite the filmmaker's meticulous attention to detail, Gangs of New York contains numerous mistakes and errors. Ready to spot them with us? Let's begin. At the beginning of the film, the razor leaves a minor red line on Priest Vallon's face rather than a deep scratch. Strangely, it shifts from his right cheek to his left. The prayer recited by Vallon in 1846 did not exist.
Angel, defend us in battle. Be our protector.
It was composed by Pope Leo XIII in 1888. Additionally, as Vallon and his son ascend the catacombs, the priest conducts mass facing the congregation, though until the 1960s, priests were required to face away from the people. During the fight between the natives and the dead rabbits, many actors appear to fake their strikes rather obviously. Vallon sustains a severe axe blow to his arm, one that should have rendered it useless, yet in the next shot, he doesn't even acknowledge the injury. In wide shots of the city, there are no trees around the square, even though they are visible in the previous scene. Amsterdam and Johnny can be seen talking in the crowd before their characters have met in the storyline. Amsterdam retrieves the knife that killed his father, which is now wrapped in fabric, despite being left unwrapped in the hiding spot 16 years earlier. Later, when Amsterdam looks into a mirror, he seems to stare directly at the camera instead of his reflection. Bill describes the 5 Points intersection as being where 5 streets meet, but historically, only 3 streets converged at that point. Little Water and Mulberry Streets were nearby but didn't meet there. Paper clips, used in the film, had not yet been invented. During Amsterdam's conversation with Johnny, his bag alternates between being on his shoulder and tucked under his arm, depending on the angle. Similarly, Johnny, who had just been trailing Amsterdam, suddenly appears ahead of him. A house is shown engulfed in flames from the outside, but inside, the fire is far less intense, and characters can move around without choking on smoke. The floor is littered with items, but when Amsterdam bends down to collect them, the space is nearly empty, and the floor looks different. Moments later, all the items are back where they were. Despite heavy rain, Happy Jack's clothing remains completely dry. Amsterdam shows a piece of paper to a Chinese character, but in the next shot, the paper is folded as it's handed over. In the background, a woman appears to be sewing the air instead of fabric. The portrait of Priest Vallon alternates between having a visible inscription and being blank, depending on the shot. When Bill stabs a man's hand, the knife appears to be embedded in the table rather than the hand. During the fight, a shelf initially holds 3 candles of varying heights, which then become 4, then 2, and finally just 1 in successive shots. A conscript is shown smoking an unlit cigar, while an apple in Amsterdam's left hand vanishes and reappears multiple times. Jenny starts removing jewelry from her victim, but is shown starting the process again in the next shot. Amsterdam alternates between holding Jenny's neck and not holding it, and she appears to be speaking to him, though no voice is heard.
Don't do that. Go back to the points and leave me to my business, or I...
People in the crowd hold colorful balloons, which were not available in the mid-19th century. Initially, all 4 characters have nooses around their necks, but seconds later, only one does, while the others are still being fitted. Jenny objects to Amsterdam removing her corset, claiming it will take too long to lace back up. However, the corset has front fastenings, making her concern unnecessary. The revolver used during the play with Bill contains black powder, which should produce a large cloud of smoke after firing, yet none is shown. A man's hand is empty in one shot, but holds a knife seconds later. During the same scene, Amsterdam tries to grab a revolver, which then lies on the ground, only to be picked up by him again moments later. Additionally, a banana, introduced to the US only after the Civil War, can be seen on the floor. A supposedly wooden beam reveals itself to be fake when paint chips off after a light impact. Amsterdam removes his top hat to hide a knife, but in the wide shot, he's still wearing the hat. A glass on a table alternates between being half full and 2/3 full in close-ups. This type of glass wasn't even designed until the 1920s. Bill slams an axe into the table to Amsterdam's left, but when he throws another axe moments later, it lands in the same spot, and the first axe is nowhere to be seen. Moreover, the thrown axe couldn't have stuck in the table, given the angle of its rotation. When dodging Bill's attack, Amsterdam turns his head to the right, but the angle changes, making it appear as though he turned left. The burn scar on Amsterdam's cheek shifts location and eventually fades away. No one stands behind McGloin in one shot, but a priest suddenly appears there seconds later. A newspaper handed to Amsterdam by Tweed is dated July 12, 1863. The draft riots occur between July 13th and 16th, and much more time passes in the film than one day. Amsterdam is initially standing on the porch looking at the crowd from afar, but in the next shot, he's suddenly at the front of the crowd. McGinn's club is tied to his right hand, but it's suddenly untied, and in his left hand moments later. A shattered window also inexplicably repairs itself. The prop axe Bill throws at McGinn bounces off a door frame and lands on the ground. Yet another axe is shown lodged in McGinn's back. A priest's liturgical vestment, the maniple, is worn on the right arm instead of the left, which is incorrect. Minister Schermerhorn died 12 years before the events depicted in the film, while snooker, a form of billiards, wasn't invented until 12 years later. Blue balls used in the game only appeared in the early 20th century. Barnum's American Museum is shown burning, though it didn't catch fire until 1865. Jenny is seen holding onto a crate as she rises, but in the next shot, she is only crawling toward it. US Navy ships are shown bombarding New York during the riots. Such an attack couldn't have happened, as the ship's cannons lacked the range and explosive power depicted in the film. Which of these mistakes stood out to you the most? Or did you notice others? Share your thoughts. Deleted scenes. The runtime of the initial work print for Gangs of New York reached 3 hours and 36 minutes, and it notably did not include any voiceover narration. Harvey Weinstein repeatedly insisted on shortening the film's length, and Martin Scorsese was ultimately forced to make some concessions. However, Scorsese himself preferred the work print version, which he showed to his friends and referred to as his favorite cut. Interestingly, Scorsese and editor Thelma Schoonmaker created 18 alternative versions of Gangs of New York, all of which they deemed less satisfactory than the final theatrical release. Despite widespread interest, a director's cut or additional footage has never been officially released. Scorsese firmly believes that audiences should only see one definitive version of a film. Worldwide recognition. The premiere of Gangs of New York was initially scheduled for December 21st, 2001. However, Martin Scorsese was unable to complete filming on time, and the release was postponed by an entire year. The director later revealed that additional shoots continued until October 2002. Cameron Diaz was notably displeased that her 6-week contract ultimately stretched to 6 months. Harvey Weinstein originally planned to release the film on December 25, 2002, but that date coincided with the release of another Leonardo DiCaprio movie, Catch Me If You Can. DiCaprio opposed pitting his two films against each other, and Weinstein's colleagues convinced him that the violent nature of Gangs of New York would not attract family audiences during the Christmas season. Ultimately, the film was released on December 9th, but even that date failed to yield the desired box office success. The movie earned a modest $77.8 million in the US and Canada, with a worldwide total of $193.7 million, barely enough to cover production costs. The film's original budget of $83 million had ballooned to $100 million due to the reshoots, with an additional $35 million spent on marketing. To help fund the extended post-production phase, Scorsese returned his entire $6 million salary, and DiCaprio forfeited a significant portion of his $10 million paycheck. Cameron Diaz, however, earned $17.5 million for her role, though the salaries of other cast members remain undisclosed. Most critics gave positive reviews, praising Daniel Day-Lewis's extraordinary performance and the meticulous historical details. However, some noted that Gangs of New York fell short of Scorsese's greatest works. Cameron Diaz's portrayal of Jenny sparked significant debate, with many considering her casting a glaring misstep and her Irish accent one of the worst in cinema history.
And leave me to my business, or I will open your throat, so help me God.
Historians commended the film's accurate portrayal of mid-19th century New York and the discrimination faced by immigrants, but criticized its exaggerated levels of violence and the overrepresentation of Chinese immigrants. Gangs of New York was nominated for numerous awards, but often left empty-handed. The Academy Awards recognized the film with 10 nominations, including Best Picture, but it failed to win any. Similarly, at the BAFTAs, Daniel Day-Lewis was awarded Best Actor, but the film lost in the other 11 categories. Day-Lewis's performance was celebrated with accolades from other organizations, such as the Screen Actors Guild and the Satellite Awards, which also honored the film for Best Production Design and Best Editing. The Golden Globes awarded Martin Scorsese Best Director, and U2's The Hands That Built America won Best Original Song. At the time of its release, Gangs of New York was Scorsese's most expensive film, a record later surpassed by The Irishman and Killers of the Flower Moon. It marked the beginning of Scorsese's long and fruitful collaboration with Leonardo DiCaprio. Daniel Day-Lewis, meanwhile, appeared in just 5 films over the next 15 years, earning 2 Academy Awards before retiring from acting in 2017. Does Gangs of New York rank among your favorite Martin Scorsese films?